Welcome everyone to today's webinar on advanced JMeter training. My name is Ophir Prusak from JMeter. I'm the VP of Customer Success. Today's session will be recorded, so we will send out a link to the recording. And if you have any questions in today's webinar, by all means, you can ask questions in the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. And at the end, we will have some time for some Q&A. So today's session is really about advanced JMeter training. Some of the stuff we're going to cover is threads, ramp up and loops, finding breaking points, reporting, JMeter optimizations, the concept of concurrent users versus request per second in JMeter. Going to go over some script logic controllers, functional testing and checking for errors, a little about third-party plugins, advanced reporting, and at the end, some Q&A. So we have a lot to cover. I'm not going to have time to go into detail into everything. To start off, actually, I do want to say just a quick recap of what we covered last time. For those of you who haven't had a chance to review or haven't had a chance to look at the previous webinar we gave, if you do a quick Google search for Learn JMeter in 60 minutes, it really goes over the basics. We're not going to go over all this stuff, but just a quick refresher about some of the stuff that we talked about, the whole concept of a test plan. This is a vocabulary that we're going to be using. A thread group, where basically how you create users, samplers, config elements, a timer, adding a delay, a listener in terms of reporting, logging, assertions, error checking, pre and post processors, logic controller, and the workbench. So what I thought I'd do today, which is a little different from last time, is instead of just being very academic, let's actually go through the process of what you as a performance engineer might actually need to do and see how we apply that within JMeter. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A. So let's take a look at actually 3 different websites that I use as test websites. They're each hosted with a different platform. And let's actually run a performance test on these 3 platforms. And that'll really help us, I guess, just put together all the concept of creating the test, running the test, looking at the reports. Last time, we really talked about just a single user. And performance testing is really all about understanding what the breaking limits are, or I guess how much load your website can actually handle. So that's what we're going to do today in live, real time with JMeter and JMeter as well. So here's a Ghost platform. It's a blogging platform that we're going to be throwing some load at. We're going to be looking at a WordPress installation as well. And last but not least, I'm going to be testing, there's a web server called the Monkey web server. It's a high performance web server. In order to test it, what I actually did was just downloaded some content from the New York Times, put it on my own server. So I'm not hitting the New York Times website, but I'm using that just as some static content to really see how hard I can push the servers. So let's go ahead and fire up JMeter. So here's my JMeter installation. There we go. And as you said, again, on the left, we have the tree. Here's elements, at the top, the icons, and the workbench. So the first thing you want to really understand is, let's say the boss comes and says, well, we have our website, and I want to know how much traffic can we handle. So the way we actually handle traffic, or the way we actually measure traffic, is the concept of slowly increasing load and seeing at what point does the website really break. So if you think about it, when just one user is on the website, obviously can handle the load. But the best way to really find where the breaking point is, imagine if you're slowly increasing the number of users who are hitting the site. So you start with 1 user, and then 2 users, and 3 users, and so forth, until you hit maybe 1,000 users or 10,000 users. And over time, you're going to see what the response times are like. So I went ahead and created, let me go ahead and load it. File open. Here you go, New York Times. So I went ahead and created in advance here we go, New York Times. Really simple, but it covers a lot of stuff that we've talked about, test plan that goes over the different elements that you're going to have. Now, a lot of these stuff we didn't talk about last time, so let's actually dig in and look at the elements to create a realistic test plan. So you obviously have the thread group. This is the number of users, ramp up period, loop count, etc. So if you look at this script, and this script is really easy, it's very simple, it's just a single request. But let's say I'd make a script just to make things a little more applicable with 2 requests. So here's a script with 2 requests, a home page, then another page. At the top, I have some what's called configuration elements again, and then I have what's called some listeners, which will provide me the reporting type of information that I need. So these, again, it's a right click on the thread group, add, and here's how you add the different elements. So if I go to a config element, you can see these HTTP cache manager, cookie manager, and header manager, as well as request defaults. So I've already went ahead and added some of these. So almost every single web-based test you're going to want to be doing, you're going to want a cache manager and a cookie manager. And as you can guess, the cookie manager is going to do the same implementation as you would if you had cookies on a real browser. Most websites really require cookies. And cache manager, I have to say, is critical in terms of getting accurate results of what a real browser would behave like. With a cache manager, you're basically simulating the browser's cache. Without that, every request is just going to basically look like it's a new request. So let's start with actually running this. And the listeners that I have here are the view results tree, graph results, summary report, and view results and table. And before I start, let's actually go back to where we started in terms of threads, ramp ups, and loops. So within the thread group, this is how you define a group of users. You have the number of threads. Again, this is the maximum number of users you're going to be testing with. And I'm going to start with just a really simple test of 1 or 2 users to kind of debug what I'm doing. And then I'm going to show you how to ramp up to lots of users. Ramp up period. So if you think about a test is always going to start with 1 user, and then you're going to ramp up to the total number of users. In this case, it's 20. So over a period of 40 seconds, I'm going to ramp up to 20 users. And the loop count means how many times am I going to loop over this test plan. So I could say, you know what, I could say I just want to loop over 10 times. But in most cases, I like to loop over and over and over again until ultimately you basically get to the maximum amount of users and then just kill the test manually or based on the amount of time you want. So in this test, you can see everything is empty. And I'm going to go ahead now and hit the play button, the screen play button. On the top right-hand corner, you'll also see the number of users currently running. Oh, we have an error. This error actually, obviously, is because I just added this HTTP request with nothing in it. So I'm just going to delete that really quick. And if I do Command E, it'll actually reset all the data. Again, and again, hit play just to show what's going on. You can see I'm making a request to the home page over and over and over again. And I'm going to go ahead and hit stop just so we can kind of get an idea of what's going on. So you can see this first request, the response code is 200. And then there's another request where the response code is 304. So 304 again, and this is already asks you the questions, what it is that you want to test. You want to test a single person hitting the refresh button, in which case the actual content would be cached. Or do you want to be testing where there's a new user every time there's a new request, which is de facto what you probably want to be testing. Because if it's cached, you're not really putting any load on the back end. So under the cache manager, you'll notice I have under clear cache each iteration, it's not checked. When I run a test, I always have clear cache each iteration checked. So every single request, you're going to get a response code 200, and the size of the response is going to be the whole page. Now you can see this initial page request, this home page, it had a lot of sub requests in it. Wow, that's a lot of sub requests. All these files. So these are all kind of the image and CSS and JS includes on the actual page I was testing, this New York Times page. And if we go to the HTTP request itself, this is where we get into the embed resources from HTML files. So this is really important in terms of what it is that you want to test. if you have this checked where it says retrieve all embedded resources, it's going to go through the HTML of the file and try to pull every time it sees an include of a CSS or an image, etc. So going back to these view results tree, even though I have a single request, you can see there are sub requests of all these files inside. This is all part of the HTML. And then the time that it takes to load this entire page includes all the included files. So I go to view results in table, you can see that the number of bytes from the request where it's not 304, where I'm loading the whole thing, is actually a total of about 2 megabytes. Because again, it's the HTML plus all the included files. On the other hand, on the requests where the status was a 304, so it was just cached, it's just 209 bytes. So obviously it's really, really fast to request. So I'm going to go and delete all this. Again, Command E. I change the cache manager to clear cache each iteration. Let's do file save. Cookie manager, I have there as well. And now if I hit play, you'll notice 1 user, 2 users, 3 users. So the view results tree will show me all the results, every single result, and all the sub requests. Graph results. This will show me a very rudimentary graph of the data. This is a listener. By the way, these ones at the bottom with the little kind of monitoring icon, these are all listeners. I just simply do right click, add a listener, and I can get these listeners, which will show me data. So the view results tree, this is great for debugging, but it takes up a huge amount of memory. So you shouldn't really use it unless you're debugging. Graph results, this shows me a nice graph. Well, I don't know if it's a nice graph, but it shows me a graph with some data. So you can see the average throughput. This is just high-level KPIs. Summary report, this is actually a little more interesting. It shows you how many samples and the summary of all the requests. And view results in table will show you every single result in tabular format. Now, as you can guess, the fact that I'm storing all this information actually takes up a lot of memory. And as we'll go into a little later, you'll see that when we're running production tests, we actually shouldn't have any samplers or as few samplers as possible. So everything looks good here so far. You can see some data. I'm going to go ahead and stop. I just want to make sure everything looks good. Again, file save. And now in order to run this and truly see where the breaking point is, because I don't know if I have enough CPU power, enough power on my own PC to push these servers to its limits. So I'm going to upload these to BlazeMeter. BlazeMeter is kind of a JMeter in the cloud solution provider. And just run them from the BlazeMeter in order to have these run in the cloud with as much horsepower as I need. And then we can see what's going on there. So here, I'm going to add a test. And I'm going to call the first one is going to be, let's call this monkey server ny times, not my times, ny times. I personally like California as a location. I'm going to upload the file. Here is my advanced JMeter. So this is ny times. And, you know, I'm thinking a single engine is probably enough to push this to its limit. If not, we'll see. And, or you know what, let's actually do 4 engines, each engine with, I want to push this up to 1,000 users. I think 1,000 users will definitely kill the users. Again, my point is saying what's the breaking point? But I want the ramp up time to be a little slower. I want the ramp up time to be, let's say, 10 minutes. And what we're going to do is we're going to come back in a few minutes to see how this is going. So the ramp up time is going to be 10 minutes, 600 seconds. So again, as I was saying beforehand, this data here that you're seeing in terms of the number of users, ramp up time, in the BlazeMeter interface, you can also define that. This is simply means how long it takes to ramp up to the total number of users. So going back to BlazeMeter, and I want the duration of each test. I don't need a long time test. For me, I think a 20-minute test should definitely be enough. And I'm going to go ahead and hit save. So we're going to come back to this after we start. I'm going to go ahead and start the test. Launch servers. And then I should see Okay, the test has been launched. So if I go now back to test and reports, I'm going to do the exact same thing with the other two servers. And then we're going to talk more about JMeter optimizations, concurrent users versus request per second, some of the other advanced stuff, and then come back to here to actually look at the results. I'm going to hit duplicate. That'll save me some time in terms of having to define everything. And this time it's going to be WordPress test. I'm going to upload the file. So these are ones that I created beforehand. It's exactly the same idea. And WordPress. I can actually delete this. I don't need it. Again, 1,000. I can even tell the WordPress server it's the WordPress server is going to probably crash at like 200 users. So I'll even do this less. Let's say 300 users tops for the WordPress server. Save. And again, these are relatively low-powered machines, so I know I'm going to be able to kill them. But the whole point is to find what the actual, at what point am I killing them? In other words, what's their breaking point? That's really the question that we want to be answering today. And we do that through reporting. So that's been started, test and reports. And last but not least, I'm going to do the ghost blog. And we'll come back to these in a few minutes. We'll also see how different backends scale in different ways. That's very interesting to understand. How does your backend scale? Does it scale well? Does it scale badly? There's different patterns of scaling that you can immediately see if your backend is optimized or not. And we'll see this in the reports. So this is going to be the ghost blog test. And this I'll push back to actually 1,000 users. Here we go. Let's upload the file. .8 1,000 users. Let's save this. And this is the ghost blog. Let's go ahead and hit start. 1,000 users. Okay. So as these three tests are running, and if you go here to, I'll just wait for it says launching test. Under test and reports, you'll see that all three of them are running. We'll come back to these in a few minutes. Just from a technical perspective, what's happening is that JMeter is launching dedicated load servers in the cloud in order to create the load required for this test. I definitely could run them from my own PC. I wouldn't be able to create, I think, enough load to run them, all three of them in parallel, that's for sure. The built-in reports, to be honest, I'm not so crazy about the built-in reports to really understand what the breaking point is. When I try to find the breaking point, for me, it's really a question of how many users can the backend handle? Does it die at, let's say, 10 users or 20 users or 100 users? So in terms of reporting, as I said, you do have these built-in reports. View tree, I can tell you already, this is great for debugging. You don't want to use a view tree when you're actually running reports. It's going to kill your backend. Graph results. This will show you some high-level data in terms of what the current response times are, averages, median, etc. The main problem is you really don't know how many users you currently have. So I don't know if this point here, where the response time is, let's say, around 4 seconds, am I at 10 users or 100 users? Summary report, this will show you again high level what's going on, but I don't have see over time. And view results in table, again, this is just a certain point of time. I don't really get the visualization. So I think if you talk to existing JMeter users, they'll all tell you that the built-in JMeter reports are lacking, to put it nicely. Which brings me to, what are your options then if you want to ultimately look at some nice reports? So first of all, if you're using BlazeMeter. You can always get BlazeMeter's awesome reports, but there are also third-party tools you can do for reportings. And some of the more popular ones are, and I'm jumping a little ahead in terms of third-party plugins, but I want to show you this in terms of reporting. If you go to jmeter-plugins.org, it's an awesome website which has third-party plugins to do all sorts of stuff, and some of them we're going to handle today. But if I go into the standards set, you'll notice that they have, in terms of graphs, some pretty cool graphs that you can add to your own local JMeter in terms of, let's say, transactions per second, or active threads over time, or response times over time. So you can pick whichever one you want, but I'm just gonna pick one of them. And here you can immediately see, for instance, this shows you over time what the actual number of threads are and the response time. This will give you kind of a much better idea of what you're looking for in terms of the graphs. Keep in mind that these do require additional burden on the JMeter itself. I can go back and pick some other ones, server hits per second. So again, all these are pretty cool graphs that you probably definitely want to have. They will require you to install them locally, as well as I said, they do add extra burden to JMeter itself. And by extra burden, what I mean is when you're trying to push, let's say, 1,000 or more than 1,000 concurrent users on a single machine, then JMeter itself could be the bottleneck in terms of if you're hitting, let's say, 100% CPU on your local machine, and a lot of these plugins will cause 100% CPU if you use them with too many users, then definitely you should think about doing post-processing. In other words, doing all the processing after the fact. Or with BlazeMeter, we actually do all the processing in parallel on our own machines. So you don't need to add any listeners. We'll actually show them on our own machines. I just want to make sure that all three of these are running okay before we continue with some of the other stuff, like concurrent users versus requests per second, etc. I'm going to pick, let's say this is NY times. I'm going to click on the report tab. And I just want to make sure everything looks good. Yeah, okay, everything looks good, excellent. So here I can actually see a number of users, and we'll get back to this in a minute. But this basically gives me the information I want. So we're looking good here. Just want to make sure they're all looking good in terms of data. This data, by the way, that you're seeing, it comes in real time as the test is being performed. And that's pretty cool that you don't have to wait till the end of the test. Okay, this is looking good too. And last but not least, I just want to make sure that the ghost one is looking good. Click and report. Yes, okay, so these are all looking good. We'll come back when there's a little more data and actually do the analysis of the data. So, like I said, in terms of what we're really trying to do, so we talked about threads, ramp up, and loops, and you can see here as the number of users is increasing time. Finding the breaking point is really all about increasing the number of users until the response times get really, really slow, either breaking the back end or alternatively just making it slow. Which also brings me to another question that a lot of people ask about, which is the whole concept of concurrent users versus requests per second. And by that I mean, if you look at any JMeter test just about, the way you define the load, if you think about it, it's more from a logical perspective of, imagine if we wanted to know how many concurrent users I needed to have on my website in order for the website to break. Now, that's kind of a vague question because it really depends on what those users are doing. So you can imagine if I had, let's say, 10 users, or let's say I had 100 users, and those 100 users were only doing something once a second. How does that compare with having 1,000 users, or let's say 200 users, and having them do once every 3 seconds? So it's not just a question of how many users I have on my website. It's also a question of how many hits per second am I testing. And I'll take it one step further and say that for a lot of users, especially like if you're doing API testing and you're actually testing a website, then for a lot of users, understanding the issue of how many hits per second I'm getting can be more relevant than how many users, because with an API, the concept of users isn't really relevant. It's how many hits per second can I do. So instead of looking at requests per second, instead of looking at concurrent users, let's say I wanted to set up a test where I am controlling the number of hits per second. And it might be very obvious to you pretty quickly that that doesn't exist here. There is no, well, I want to ramp up to 1,000 hits per second. It just doesn't exist natively. And the reason I say natively is there are third-party plugins, but it doesn't exist natively in terms of hits per second. JMeter at its core really thinks in a mindset of concurrent users, not hits per second. So in order to kind of get it to be, well, I want to do hits per second, not number of users, there's two ways to do so. The first and the straightforward way, which is built into JMeter, is JMeter has something called a constant throughput timer. So if you noticed right now, I have a simple test, which is hitting the home page, and I added a timer. Again, a timer is a delay after every request of 500 milliseconds on average, but I added some randomness, so it'll be kind of 200 milliseconds plus minus. So it'll be between 300 to 700 milliseconds every delay. Now, you can imagine as I'm adding more and more users, the number of hits per second is going to go up. But let's say I want to really limit the number of hits per second. So let's say my boss comes and says, well, can our API or can I website, can it handle 500 or can it handle 300 hits per second? So instead of having this type of timer, the way it works in JMeter is I need to add a lot of users, even more than I know that I need, and add a delay between requests. So imagine you had 10,000 users, yeah? And you could tell those 10,000 users, well, just make sure that the group of you together, you don't do more than 200 requests per second. And the way you do that is by adding a delay between requests. So what I'm going to add here is a timer called the constant throughput timer. I'm going to get rid of this Gaussian timer. And the constant throughput timer, to all active threads, basically means how many hits or how many requests per second do I want to make sure that I don't go over. So if I hit, let's say put here 200, what I'm saying here is never go over 200 requests per minute. Sorry, not per second. So if I wanted, let's say 10 per second, that would be 600 per minute. And if I wanted 100 per second, that would be, let's say 6,000 per minute. So what I'm saying here is that never go over 6,000 requests per minute. And the way JMeter does this is by adding a delay between the requests. Now, you can't make the request go faster. You can always add a delay. So imagine you have this kind of army of users. So in order to do this, let's say I wanted actually 10 requests per second. So I would basically say, you know what? I want, I don't know, 500 users. You do have to guesstimate to some extent how many users you want, what the average time it takes for a response to be. So let's say average response is half a second. And you can kind of say, okay, if there was no delay, how many requests per second could I hit? And then you have to say, well, let's times that by 2 or by 3 to make sure I have enough users. And then the constant throughput timer will automatically add a delay so we don't go over this limit. Now, as you can tell, this is kind of weird. And to be honest, it's not very, very straightforward. So if we go back to the JMeter plugins to the rescue, you have here under the standard set, just one second. You have under the standard set specific plugins which help you control the number of hits per second. They're called thread groups and timers. Again, the whole concept of a thread group is users. And you have the throughput shaping timer. So what this allows you to do is to say, you know what, instead of having to figure out exactly the top number of hits per second, let's say I just want to increase the number of hits per second slowly, and this is what I want it to look like. So with this plugin, you can just define the start request per second, end request per second duration. You can create a nice graph. This is similar to people who have used other more advanced tools, let's say like LoadRunner. You still need to make sure that you have enough threads to produce it. And they even talk about what the thread pool size should be like. So you still need to make sure you have enough users, but automatically this plugin will make sure that you can have a nice graph and control exactly how many hits per second you want and get that kind of slow increase. One other way you can do, and I think it's pretty cool, is if you go back to here, the constant throughput timer, if you do it instead of on all active threads, you do on this thread only. So what this basically says is per user, I don't want to go over this amount of hits per second. So if you imagine per user, let's say I don't want to go over 1 hit per second. Yeah. So 60 hits per minute, 1 hit per second. That'll guarantee that a single user will never go over 1 hit per second. And then you can slowly increase the number of users to reach the kind of more gradual increase in users per time. So that's the whole concept of concurrent users versus requests per second. And again, BlazeMeter will use, basically what it does is it's just like the normal delay, but it will see how many hits per second am I currently at. And if it's too fast, it will add that delay for you automatically. And you can't know in advance how much delay you need because it's impossible to know in advance how long the responses will be. So that's kind of in a nutshell the whole idea of concurrent users versus requests per second. So I want to go back to the reporting now that I think I have enough data for the reports. Let's look at the testing reports. Let's see, did we manage to break our servers? Because this is kind of what it's all about. These are still running, I see. Let's look at some real-time data though, the Monkey server. So again, this is a test. Basically 1,000 users. I go to the report. Ooh, interesting. This is actually a bit unexpected, I have to say, because I see the response times actually, okay, wait a second, see? So this is where you have to really be careful and try to understand what happened. So if we go back to this website, the Monkey website as I called it, and I refresh, no data received. So what's gonna often happen when you're load testing a website and really creating a lot of load, depending on your backend infrastructure, sometimes it'll just crap out. In other words, you're creating so much load that the backend server just goes and just says, I'm not even, I'm out of here. I'm not going to even respond. So when you look at the reports here, what might look, if I just get response times, what might look initially like here are the response times and they look good. Oh, they're actually going down. That's kind of weird, but awesome. My website answers in 1.8.2 seconds. What's really happening, look at the errors, is that initially there's no errors, yeah? And then the errors start to creep up, and basically as I'm increasing the number of users, I'm also increasing the number of errors. Now, obviously, you need to understand what the response time of your website is without any errors, because once you have errors, then even if it's if the fast response is there's an error, that doesn't help you. You need to understand before you hit errors. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually zoom into the first kind of few minutes. And here you can see we started with 60 users. And so this is what we're showing, increasing the number of users over time, 60 users, and then, well, kind of 160 and then 200. So I really increased the number of users a lot. And I see that I started to have errors way before I hit 1,000 users. So obviously this backend can't handle 1,000 users. It probably even can't handle more than a few hundred because I'm already getting errors here. So I'm going to go ahead and if it hasn't already, I'm going to stop this test. Graceful shutdown. And here you can see again how the number of errors per second really increased over time. So looking at this response time graph, it's very misleading. If I look at response time versus number of errors, for instance, here we go. Here I can see that the response, these initial response times, these are actually accurate response times. They even went up a bit here. And then the number of errors are going. And what often happens is that when the response is simply an error, then the response time is pretty low. So you can see here in green, the response times are low because my response was just an error. And I can dig down to the specific errors, such as non-HTTP response, yeah? Basically, the backend server said socket closed, etc. So if I look at the 200s, And maybe this is a better place to look at the 200s. The 200, this is how many times I basically got let me look at the 200s versus active users. Here we go. This is actually, or hits per second. Here we go. Oh, hits per second even went up here. So as you notice, I'm really kind of going back and forth in terms of understanding what the error was and when it happened. But what we'll often see is that the server has kind of a breaking point in terms of you can scale it up to this breaking point, but you can't scale much more. So 200 again means hey, we had a successful response. As you can see, I'm slowly increasing the number of users, and then it's basically plateauing, saying after a certain point, I'm not going to get any more hits per second out of this backend system, but I'm increasing still the number of users. Thus, I'm actually starting to see some errors. If I go back to test and reports here, I think what just happened was, let me refresh this. This one I stopped. Let's go. Actually, let's look at the WordPress one. Look at the report. This one I know for sure that I killed because I've done this before. Yeah. Ooh. Wow. Okay. There it is. Yeah. Let's look at it. So again, here's a test. I wanted to test can this backend handle 300 users. And what you'll see is that initially the response times are actually pretty good. I'm getting 700 milliseconds, 800 milliseconds. They go up a little to 2 seconds, but as I'm increasing the number of users, the response time also goes up. Again, this backend definitely can't handle more than maybe 100 users, but also the errors start to creep in. So if I look at response time versus errors, you can see that the response times are initially okay, but then the second the response times really go up, I'm also getting errors. So what I would do in this case is I would actually run the test again. And as you can see, the number of active users, you can see errors start to creep in at around 124, 150 users. So what I do is run this test again, but this time when I run it a second time, I'm going to have max users just 150 and even a slower ramp up time. So I can really see, kind of break down and find that specific point where the backend is dying on me. So I'm going to hit stop it, do graceful shutdown. And if I go back to the testing reports, we can also see in the monkey we go, the NY Times one. It takes about a minute or two for JMeter to actually spin down and to have what we call a graceful shutdown. So it does take a couple of minutes. But if I go now to edit this, I'm going to run it one more time and we'll look at this in the end and also share the URLs for you to look at yourselves. So instead of 1,000 users, because I was really pushing it way too hard, let's just push this to a total of, let's say, 200 users over time. Okay, so it's just 200 users. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to run it again. And this is kind of the iteration you probably do. You're going to first try to find where more or less is the breaking point of my website at a kind of a high level, because you don't know, is it 100 users or 1,000 users? And once you have the ballpark area, you want to do a really slow scale to see exactly where that breaking point is. So here we have a total of 200 users. This is looking good over 10 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and hit start. Launch servers. Just a message started. Go back to test and reports. I'm going to do that with the other ones as well. WordPress is inactive. There we go. That's good. Can edit it. And total of, let's just push this guy to 100 users. That should be enough. 100 users, hit save. So I personally really like reports which show me response time versus number of users, or hits per second versus response times. So for those of you who might be testing a backend for a web API or for a mobile app, you kind of really want to be looking at also response times versus hits per second versus, and not concurrent users. Go ahead and start. Because especially for an API, that's really the question you want to probably be answering is how many hits per second can I handle? So if you're looking at the reports, I can actually go back and look at the Ghost blog test. Look at the report. You'll notice you also have a hits per second, which will show you hits per second. Now this is a little misleading, the hits per second, simply because this is an average of per minute, and what looks like really high and really low is just a combination of it's kind of going up and down, as well as when I ran this test, uh, there's actually individual pages which are being loaded as part of, sorry, individual elements. So it looks a little misleading. If I look at it at the second level, and for users, we also have per second level. You'll notice it's kind of, so it is going up and down, but you know, for whatever reason, the back end, and I don't know why, but for whatever reason, the back end is kind of really just going up and down. Uh, Not very stable, as you can see. Something like a 50-second response time is really bad, while a 5-second response time is decent. Definitely, there's a lot of room for improvement on this back end. But you can see it definitely can't handle 1,000 users. So if I go back to response time. So let's also run this one more time, and let's see how it responds with just, let's say, 100 users. But this blue line is kind of really want to show you of how we're slowly increasing the load over time. So now that we have an idea of, okay, reporting, I can either use the built-in reports, or I can use the third-party reports, or I can use JMeter reports, yeah? Let's actually go into script logic controllers. So what we were seeing here beforehand, yeah, this is a really simple test of a single page. But in actuality, very often you're going to have a test which you need to add some logic to the test. It could be a loop, it could be a if, it could be a while. And again, if you right click, add logic controller, here you'll see you have, and I'm not going to go over each and every one. There's some pretty detailed documentation on the Apache JMeter website. But just to kind of, at a high level, understand, these are the things you can do. So for each controller, as you can guess, this would actually add that for each one of the elements, you can actually do something. If controller, this is probably the most basic one, is if you're able to successfully log into a website, then do something. Now, one thing which isn't maybe intuitive, I'm going to add the if controller just to show you this. And I'm going to move it to here. The way JMeter makes its requests is something called scope, as well as from top to bottom. So all the elements that are at the same level of hierarchy are going to be done top to bottom. And then within each one, you're going to have elements which are, let's say, a daughter process, or something which is a parent. So if I add here, actually, let's do this. Sorry, go back to JMeter. This if controller, I'm going to add, let's say, a sampler, and then going to be a simple HTTP request. And I'm going to also add one more sampler as HTTP request. And put it back here. So in this script, what will happen is it'll always ask for the home page. And this if controller, you can add some really simple logic. It can be an actual expression like if response was something, or if value equals something, then make the child request. So the way it works is that only if it's true, will it make the request, which are its children requests. And if it's not true, it'll just skip down to the other request. The same is if I have a loop or a while. So if I add, let's say, a logic controller of a while, again, it will continue to make all of the requests which are children of this requests. Make add a sampler again, while this condition is true. You can go to the JMeter site to understand, again, the high level of each one of them. I'm not going to go into each one. And going on to what I think is actually maybe the most important thing here is also understanding the whole concept of error checking. So for error checking, I'm going to go File. Sorry, I'm going to click on this template button here. JMeter, as of version 2.10, added something called templates, which are really cool starting points to kind of pre-made templates, for lack of a better term, to get you started. So I'm going to click on template, yeah, and I'm going to pick one of these templates, and I'm going to pick the building an advanced web test plan. I'm going to hit create. I don't want to save what I already had. In here, you can see already in it what they call an advanced template for testing. And here, there's a lot of elements which you can take a look at it. But the most important one really is what's called assertions. So you'll notice it's something with it's kind of a sampler with a little question mark. And what assertions do, basically, they allow you to ask a question, or basically to raise an error, for lack of a better term, that if certain condition isn't true, then that raises an error. And this can be based off of lots of different criteria. The most common criteria is either you're looking for a specific piece of text in a response. You can be looking for how long it takes a response to make, or you can, let's say, look for a certain field in response header. So here you'll have, for instance, yeah, I'm making a request for the home page for some website, and the response assertion, it's a text response. So I'm looking for the field to test means where am I looking for in terms of what am I checking. Substring means look for the substring. Here's the actual substring itself, title Apache JMeter. So if I am looking for this text within the response of the home page and I happen to be checking the Apache JMeter website, if this appears, then the assertion will be true and it'll just continue. And if it, excuse me, and if it fails, it isn't here, it's going to raise an error. Now, as you noticed, when you actually look at the request, if I run a simple test here, you can see it's green. Yeah, green means everything is good, everything went fine. These green means everything's good. When something doesn't happen correctly, when there's an error, then there'll actually be a different icon, like a warning icon, which means something went bad. Or like changes, here we go, something went bad. Well, the reason this actually happened was because I stopped it before it completed, and then the response assertion actually said, no, this was bad. So if we look at the assertions, right-click Add Assertions, you see there's lots of different types. Now, I'm not going to go into all of them, but the ones which you're probably going to be looking at are the HTML assertion, sorry, the response assertion, which means that I want you to look at the response, and based on the response itself, either raise an error if something happened or not. And the duration assertion. The duration assertion means I want you to test how long it took to respond to something, and if it took longer than that amount of time, raise an error. So if I do response assertion here, I can actually say in milliseconds, let's say 300 milliseconds. So if it took more than 300 milliseconds to respond, raise an error. And then when I look at my reports, if I go back to here, for instance, test and reports, I can either look at it in the JMeter reports, or I can also look at it in BlazeMeter. It's really cool. You can see the errors themselves in the reports. So if I go here, let's say to this monkey server, and I'm going to timeline. So here is the previous time that I ran this report when I did have some errors. And you'll notice all of these errors here, these are all the errors that happen. Ooh, all sorts of funky errors, the response code. But if I defined my own errors, I can also have them appear here as assertions. So if I actually go to BlazeMeter's tour report, I'll click on tour. Here you can see duration assertion. So basically, I defined within my JMeter script a duration assertion that if the response is more than 3 seconds, raise an error. So I can also see them automatically here in the reports. So that's really cool in terms of understanding what your errors are. So we talked about functional testing in terms of finding errors. We talked about script logic, third-party plugins. There's a lot of really cool plugins here, which we're not going to go into. But I will say a lot of the stuff which you want to do, you might be able to handle here. And last but not least, I just want to check one more time in terms of the test and reports to see what's going on. Actually look at the reporting for the New York Times page that I was looking at, or I should say the mock-up I was doing of the New York Times. And here you can actually see a much more typical, because in terms of errors, yeah, I'm getting some embedded resource errors. But for the most part, not that many errors. Embedded resource simply means like a 404 error. But here I can see, so in this example, my boss comes and says, how many concurrent users can the website handle? You can say, well, let me see. I see up to 100 users, no errors whatsoever, yeah? Look at response times, up to 100 users. I can also see the response time. So there's really two questions you need to be asking or answering. What are the response times and how many errors are you getting? Because, even if you're not getting an error, but the response times are really going up like this, you probably need to ask yourself, at what point do you consider that an error? But those are the two kind of questions I always look at. If I look at hits per second, here I can see hits per second kind of going up, and I can see this, my specific backend probably really can't handle more than 12 hits per second. That's really the most it can handle in terms of the specific website. So again, you can look at the different, things you have in your backend, what's going on, and understand, is it the latency? Latency, by the way, will tell you how long to first byte, what's called, how long to actually start responding, and response time, how long it takes to answer the whole request. Waterfall, I want to see if this will work. I'm not 100% sure. Waterfall, it didn't work in this case. Errors, like I said, to show you the errors. So in terms of reporting, in terms of finding the breaking point, concurrent users versus requests per second, script logic, third-party plugins, we really went over all of that. One last thing I will say before I go into Q&A is in terms of JMeter optimizations. So if you check anywhere online in terms of, well, how do I push JMeter to the limit? And by pushing JMeter to the limit, here is an example of a test. And I'm just doing one user. But in actuality, you need to push maybe 100 or 1,000 users to find your breaking point. Now, what's going to happen is if I, let's say, test with 1,000 users and I start the test, and I did this when I was actually preparing for today's webinar, it crashed my machine multiple times. Or I should say it crashed JMeter more correctly. Because using these listeners here, all these listeners, they take up a lot of memory usage and a lot of CPU. So I was getting out of memory error all the time. So what you want to do is you want to kind of play around, do your debugging, and then when you actually run the test, you should really disable all the listeners which aren't crucial. Even better is to not use any listeners at all and do a post-analysis of the test by looking at the JTL file itself, or by using BlazeMeter if you want to do so with an online service, or just look at something like kind of aggregate graph or response time graph, just some high level graphs which will show you, like response time graph like this, which will show you some high level KPIs. They're not quite as intensive as something which records every single request, but these are definitely some places which you can do some optimization. So at this point, I will open it up to some questions. And of course, I'll be sending the recording, as I said, at the end to everyone. So looking at the questions, so somebody asks, actually looking at the very beginning, running a test for a portion an hour. In terms of how long you want to run a test, if you're doing it just with JMeter on its own, you can't really tell it to stop after a certain amount of time. You just have to kind of let it run and stop. If you're doing it on BlazeMeter servers, if I go add test, then I can simply define here under duration available for each thread group. This is kind of a way of saying after how much time am I going to kill the test. So I personally, find for most testing purposes, 20 minutes is usually enough. I can do 50 minutes, but this will tell you how to kill it after a certain amount of time. VJ asks about setting JMeter script to test on a two-way SSL environment. Excellent question. So if you want to test a two-way SSL environment, usually what's involved is adding to JMeter your own SSL certificate, because that's usually what's involved. What I would suggest is if you do a quick search for JMeter SSL certificate issues or proxy SSL, basically all this stuff like import SSL certificate. There's some awesome posts I usually find online. The official JMeter manual is usually okay. My personal favorite is to ask on Stack Overflow. If you ask an intelligent question on Stack Overflow about JMeter, you'll usually get a good answer within a day or two. Going on to how do you set retrieve all embedded resources as the request default? Excellent question. So if I didn't go over it beforehand, you have also a sampler. Sorry, you have a config element called defaults. So I don't actually, here we go, HTTP request defaults. So what I can do is if I add, I usually like to add it at this level, add config element, it's called HTTP request defaults. There we go. I'm going to move it up here so you can see it. I don't need it twice. And what the request defaults do, and this is the best way to actually write your test in general, is that any field that you fill out here, it can be the server name, it can be the path, the IP, anything you want. This will be the default for your request underneath unless you specifically change the value. So if it's a checkbox, then you're basically saying I always want it to be checked, yeah. Though if you have in this case, it's always going to be checked as the default. But if you had a value here, let's say is your server name for let's say google.com, and then here you left this empty, server name or IP, then it would use the value from the request defaults. So that's how you can always have defaults which are going to apply to all the children. Does BlazeMeter run the most recent JMeter? Yes. When you actually go and create a test, here we go. You can pick up a JMeter version. We always support the latest version of JMeter within a week of it being released. So you can pick anything from 2.11 down to 2.32. One of the reasons that I like to sometimes pick 2.8 is actually a bug/feature in JMeter since version 2.9. When you're running distributed tests with multiple servers, JMeter 2.9 and up actually doesn't like it. If one server fails, it brings down the whole test. So that's why I like 2.8. The Google plugins, Bart actually also asks. So the Google plugin, so I see the already answers there. You can definitely go to the JMeter plugins, which used to be called Google Code plugins. Somebody asks about capturing the graph data and running in silent mode instead of graphing in real time. So I'm not going to go into the specifics right now of how to graph. I will say if you do a search, there's lots of different options out there for graphing after the fact. There also is a website, if you go to the Google Plugins website, which allows you to upload your JTL files and then graph them after the fact. There is a question by the difference between delay used in constant typer and ramp up used in the thread group. Okay, so that's a good question. I want to make sure that's clear. The ramp up here, in seconds. Actually, let me do it this way. A really simple example. If I say I want 1,000 threads with 1,000-second ramp up, then basically that means is that for the first second of the test, there's going to be one thread or one user. And then the second of the test, I'm going to have 2 users and 3 users and so forth. So imagine every second, I'm adding a new user. So after 1,000 seconds, I'm going to have 1,000 users. Alternatively, let's say I did this and I said I wanted a 200-second ramp up. So in this case, basically I'm saying every second I'm adding 5 users. So you can imagine this is how long it takes to go from 1 user to the number of total users. This is just adding users. This isn't adding delay between requests. All these delays you have here, this is a delay between the requests for a single user. So that's the difference. Somebody asks, what about mentioning the number of threads in the JMX file before uploading to JMeter, before uploading to BlazeMeter? Excellent question. So as you've noticed, you can define the thread properties in your JMeter script, and you can also define them in BlazeMeter. So if I click on here, complete control, I have two options. I can uncheck this override JMeter thread group parameters. And what will happen is that BlazeMeter will leave your thread group parameters as is. If I click on it, then I can override it. And the reason this is very convenient is that after you've uploaded your script, if you want to run the test again, this time with a different number of users, you don't have to go back, edit the script, and upload it again. You can just override the thread group parameters from the interface. Dominique asks about JMeter and integrated web browser plugin. So I'm not going to go too much into that. I will say if you go to the JMeter plugin project, there is something called the WebDriver set or the WebDriver plugin. And the WebDriver plugin allows you to run WebDriver Selenium scripts from within JMeter, which initially you might be saying, oh, that's totally awesome. I don't need to worry now about clicks and Ajax and whatever. I'm just going to do my Selenium script and let Selenium have to worry about the specific requests. While from a technical perspective, this might sound very appealing, what's going to happen is that the WebDriver plugin requires a single CPU core per thread. So if you're on an 8-core machine, you're not going to be able to run a test with more than 10 threads, simply because it's running a real Firefox or a real Chrome instance, and you just can't do massively parallel tests. I mean, you cannot run on a single machine 1,000 Chrome instances or 1,000 Firefox instances. It won't work. It's just too much. On the other hand, obviously with JMeter, you can run 1,000 threads in parallel since it doesn't require anywhere the amount of resources. So Josh asks an excellent question: is how important it is to match the typical clickstream of your website with your JMeter scripts? That's an excellent question, Josh. And the answer is it depends. And I know that's not what you wanted to hear, but what you're probably going to see is two different types of testing. One type of testing is really understanding what's the breaking point of your backend. In other words, okay, let's actually see, can we push our backend database in terms of just making certain requests that we're not going to hit the database, or how much can we push individual elements? And those are great just to kind of get kind of ballpark figures of how close are we, or how close are you to actually your current limits. In terms of matching the typical clickstream of your website, I will say that it's important to have fairly accurate, but it doesn't need to be exactly accurate. In other words, here's a good example, and here's a real world case where it is important. A e-commerce customer was doing a test in terms of the checkout process, and they were testing with a single product. So this e-commerce customer had thousands of products, but they just wanted to test the checkout, and they were testing only with a single product. So they had, thousands of users adding this product to the cart and then doing the checkout. What happened in reality, when they actually Black Friday came, their site crashed, because in reality, users were actually doing random different products, and the initial test they did was just hitting the cache, while in reality, when people were doing this in real life, it wasn't hitting the cache. So what I like to say is kind of an 80-20 trade-off, where if you notice that 80% of the people are, let's say, just hitting a group of, let's say, 5 products, and 20% of the users are hitting random products, then you definitely want to have something which more realistically reflects actual user usage on your website. So you definitely want to have something which is kind of fairly accurate. It doesn't need to be 100% accurate. And at the end of the day, what's going to happen is, as you're testing, you're going to be able to compare, well, how does my website react when I add randomness versus not randomness, and know how important it is. Gilbert asks, is there an async sampler that can complete requests where the browser is looking for polling before the response to come back? There is a WebSocket sampler. It's a third-party sampler, if that's what you're talking about, where it'll keep the WebSocket open. If you just do a quick search on JMeter WebSocket, it'll answer that. Alexander asks, is there an alternative, maybe free, to New Relic to finding bottlenecks? So what I will say is that if you go, here's a little secret, if you go to newrelic.com/blazemeter, they have what's called the standard edition. And the standard edition is much better than their free edition. It's not as good as their paid edition, but it gives you 2 weeks retention data. So to be honest, I don't know of anything which is free, which is as good as New Relic to finding bottlenecks. But I will say the standard edition, which is free, if you just sign up from New Relic/blazemeter, will definitely get you more than their normal free version. But yeah, if you want something which is really good, you probably do have to pay. New Relic does have their startup plans, which I think are very reasonable, which will also get you, much cheaper than the normal plans. Somebody asks, does blazemeter support third-party plugins? Yes, they definitely do. So when I go here to create load test and I upload my file, I can either upload a JMeter script, or I can upload a jar file, I can upload a CSV file, or any other file which my JMeter script requires. I can upload it together with my JMX, and blazemeter will run them. We run out of the box JMeter in terms of what we're running. We're not running some other tool which just looks and acts like JMeter. We are actually running JMeter. So if it will run on JMeter on a Mac or a Linux box, then it will run with JMeter on our machines. Yugi asks, is there a way to test local or production sites using JMeter? So in terms of local, I'm guessing you mean behind the firewall. I guess the whole point of using JMeter locally, so here, this is JMeter. When I hit the play button, it's going to run JMeter on my PC. So if you're behind the firewall and you want to test from behind the firewall, you can definitely do testing just with JMeter on your own from behind the firewall, and you're going to get some results, and that'll definitely work to some extent. And by some extent, I mean your biggest issue is going to be, what if I need to create more load than my single PC can handle? At that point, if you do a quick search on distributed JMeter, you'll see that JMeter does have a distributed testing built in, though it's not as simple as I would like it to be, which is ultimately why we created blazemeter. Blazemeter does also have a enterprise solution which includes behind the firewall load agents. You can contact us at support or sales at blazemeter, and I can tell you more about that. Another question, what if you want to run a load test with file downloads? Where does blazemeter store those download files? So yes, we definitely do support JMeter as well as blazemeter file downloads. All the files will be downloaded to the same directory, or to a single directory. So actually, if I show this really quick, a lot of places, if you're used to using a path, so use a certain path when you're looking for a file, that can either be a CSV file or it can be a file download. Just don't use any path information, and JMeter will find it if you're using blazemeter. In other words, instead of path x/file name, just use file name, and blazemeter will find it. There's a question of, how do you simulate real traffic using JMeter? I am not quite sure I understand the question. Ultimately, you simulate real traffic by looking at what your real traffic is. So you definitely need to understand what users are doing. You can use the blazemeter Chrome plugin to also record your activity as a real user would, and just play that back. And I think that's pretty real traffic. I have seen some people who use an Apache type, or basically a log file, and play back the log file to simulate real traffic. That's another way of doing it. In terms of thinking time, again, the best way to do that is just add the delays as needed for the thinking time. The steps involved in running a test and then post-processing the results. So to post-process the results, what I would actually suggest is if you go to JMeter plugins, sorry, if you go to JMeter plugins, you'll notice that there is a site called Load Sophia. Here we go, Load Sophia. This is a site where you can upload your JTL files and also get some cool reports. So if you just need non-real-time, nice graphs, you can definitely load Sophia, and it'll give you some nice graphs. Going back to the questions, just a second. For the waterfall graph to work, do we need to set up JMeter waterfall? So no, you don't. For the waterfall graph to work, and actually let me show you what they mean. There's a question, what about the waterfall graph? So if I go to blazemeter.com and I click on tour, and then under tour, you'll notice there's a graph called WebDriver. So what's actually happening, this is a waterfall graph where once per minute, we will fire off automatically. You don't need to do anything in your own script. We do this in parallel to what you're doing. We will fire off a Selenium or Firefox browser, a single thread, and we usually do this about once per minute, and this gives you this really nice waterfall graphs. Now, the easiest way to actually do this, or I should say the correct way to do this, is if I go here to add test, is at the moment, the way you need to do this is actually here under user experience monitoring with Selenium. You can enter the URLs of the pages you want to test, and these are the URLs which we'll use for the WebDriver/waterfall graph. Stan asks, when running the throughput shaping timer, what counts as a hit, each sample or each sub request? So that that has more to do with how you define your samples and less as a throughput shaping timer. So when you actually have a sample, if you go back to JMeter, so this is a normal sample, as you'll notice, and it's at the top level hierarchy of my JMeter test plan. So this is going to be a hit. Now, if I want to have, if I do say retrieve all embedded resources, if I did this, by the way, then what's going to happen is that even though the request has a lot of sub-requests, they're not considered individual hits. It's the whole page with all the embedded resources are going to be a single hit. So that's how a hit is defined. The other thing you can do is if I add here a config element called the simple config element, then sorry, not the config element. Sorry, if I add here a controller called a simple controller, I can add multiple, or actually the transaction controller is even better. Sorry, if I add the transaction controller, that's the best one. The transaction controller is really the best way that I can either say generate a parent sample and include duration of timer and pre-post processing generated sample. So this allows me to define what I call a transaction, which could be multiple requests. And then I have more control over, do I want to have the transaction control also be a sample, and whether I want or not include the timers of the individual requests underneath. Can JMeter detect if there's a Java heap issue? No, it can't. It'll basically, you're going to get an error saying out of memory, and then you simply go and add more memory to your Java heap. Is it possible to simulate user actions like login, log out from a web service using JMeter? By all means. So Edson asks about login, log out. I would suggest you check out my Learning JMeter in 60 Minutes webinar, which I gave a few weeks ago. If you do Learn JMeter in 60 Minutes, where I specifically covered how to do user authentication with login and log out from a website or a web service, whatever it is that you want. So Bart asks, what are JTL files? That's a good question. Sorry about that. JTL files are the log files that JMeter creates. So whenever you run a test, and if I go back to here and let's say look at this test report, you're going to see if I go back to load results, it'll say there was 2,349 samples or requests in this test. So the JTL file, it's literally a log file which shows you every single request and some high-level data about the request. And you can define, usually it's an XML file, you can also have it be a CSV file, but that's where all the kind of low-level raw data is. It's very similar, I should say, to an Apache log file. And when you want to do post-processing of the results, very often you're going to need the JTL file of the raw data. So, Alexander asked an excellent question. What are the weaknesses of JMeter and the common misuses and mistakes that are made? You know what? I'm not sure to say what the weaknesses are. I think, to be honest, JMeter's biggest weakness, I have to say, I think is its documentation. JMeter is an awesome tool, but I don't think its documentation is clear. I think it has great documentation in terms of if you have a specific question, but in terms of learning JMeter, I don't think there's a single place which you can really understand JMeter. Other than that, in terms of really understanding how JMeter thinks, sometimes it takes a little time to understand exactly. But once you get into the head of JMeter, I think it's pretty easy to use. And the common misuses and mistakes, I think it's literally just understanding that what you're testing with JMeter at the end of the day is your backend. In other words, how long does it take from the second I ask for a page or for a file to how long does it take to all that information come back? So the simplest example I can give in terms of, I think, mistake and not misuse is if I have a web page that has 500 images on it, it could be that the time it takes for my browser to initially respond is 2 seconds, because very often what's going to happen is the browser will continue to load elements in the background. While with JMeter, if I'm asking it how long does it take to load everything, I'm going to see a different number because JMeter will tell me what's the total response time for all the elements. So that's, I think, the biggest understanding is just know exactly what it is that you're measuring. So somebody asks, what does it mean by non-HTTP error, and how do I determine what was caused by the tested server or the JMeter engine? So I can tell you already that 99.999999% of the times, if there's an error, it's the tested server. It's not the JMeter engine. Yeah, JMeter is very stable. If there's an error, believe me, it's kind of like Apache web server. It's actually by the Apache group. Yeah, it's very well written. And when there's an error, these errors, whatever they should be, if I go back to my test that I had beforehand, these errors are all from your backend. So when your web server is overloaded because I'm hitting it 1,000 times per second, and it's like, okay, I give up, those errors are basically, I tried to make a request, I waited 10 seconds or whatever the timeout is, like Java NetSocket here, yeah? I waited, Java, specifically JMeter is written in Java. So not that it matters to you that much, but when you're getting a Java NetSocket error, means that JMeter was not able to actually make a connection to the backend, yeah? So, or this one, yeah, non-HTTP response. I made a connection to the server, but I didn't get back an HTTP response. So your server is basically foobarred, but I'm not getting back a response. So these errors are all your own backend server errors. Yes, the session is being recorded. We will send out a link to everyone who is here once it's online. Running non-GUI mode. So I'm not going to go into non-GUI mode. For those of you who are asking, non-GUI mode basically means running JMeter from the command line. And it's really very simple. All you do is once you have your JMX script, which you saved in the GUI, JMeter command line. And if you take a look at the how to run JMeter in the command line, or you can even look here. Actually, BlazeMeter itself, so we actually have a pretty good blog entry which talks about how to run it in the command line, all the defaults it has, etc. So it's pretty straightforward. You just run JMeter dash the name of the script dash some other command line variables which help run the command line, and then it'll run the command line. So there's some more questions specifically of BlazeMeter. Jamie asks, Jamie, just contact support at BlazeMeter and we will be able to help you with that. So somebody asks, again, there's some more questions which about distributed running. Again, contact support if this is a BlazeMeter question, and we can definitely understand. Uh, Somebody asked about material about the architecture of JMeter. Again, interesting question. And like I said, JMeter doesn't have that much information about it. I would highly suggest if you want more technical stuff, you can either ask on Stack Overflow. That's where I personally ask if I have some questions, as well as the official JMeter mailing lists. So if you go to JMeter mailing list, so JMeter does have two official mailing lists, one for users, one for developers, and mailing list. You can also look at the archives, but here we go, JMeter mailing lists. Read this and then go to this page and you can join the mailing lists and ask some questions. So that's the best place to get. Again, there's some questions about the script is eating up memory on the remote agents. Do a search for JMeter optimizations. Yeah, JMeter optimizations. There's two specific blog entries that I'm aware of that really talk about how to do kind of performance with JMeter. I don't remember offhand. Performance tuning. Here we go. Well, here, JMeter performance and tuning. Here we go. So this is actually a guest blog entry by someone else, but it talks about the specifics of how to make your JMeter as lean and mean as possible. So there's a question about, does JMeter wait for AJAX elements to be loaded on dynamic forms? JMeter does not execute JavaScript on the page. JMeter is a very fast but very simple parser in terms of it makes a request and gets a response. It will not execute anything on the page such as dynamic forms, etc. Again, more questions you can always ask support. So Nivi asks an excellent question. Is it fair to say that JMeter does not measure page rendering time? Yeah. In other words, response time does not include the user experience. I would say it depends. And by it depends, yeah, I would say that JMeter out of the box for very complex pages where there's going to be some Ajax run, etc. If you're just loading all of the elements that the page loads, then no, it's not going to be page rendering time. On the other hand, if you want to have a fairly straightforward page, which you're looking at, just some images, some CSS, then by all means it does. And what I've seen a lot of people actually do, and I think this is the best of both worlds, is they will run a test with two parts. There'll be one part, which is a JMeter script written in native JMeter, which will create the load against the server, because at the end of the day, the question you want to ask is how many users can my backend handle and what the actual response time is. So in terms of creating errors, you're going to get that with JMeter. But as response time 1 second, 2 seconds, or 3 seconds, sometimes you do need a real browser to answer that question, but you don't need the browser to create the load. So what we're seeing some people do, and I think this is actually the wave of the future, is that you're going to create the load itself with JMeter, and then in parallel, you can create a script with a WebDriver, and in that WebDriver, you're going to have a single thread or maybe two threads with a real browser, because WebDriver is a real browser, which will give you the true page rendering time. So you have one script which creates a load, another script which is running in parallel, which gives you the actual user experience time, yeah, and then you get the most of the best worlds. You get both what the backend server response time as well as the page rendering time by simply using a WebDriver Selenium script. Java socket and Java heap errors often happen in smaller hardware. Yes, they do. How do you access reports in the command line? You can't really. Well, you know what? Do a search. There are ways, or there are plugins that you can use, I should say, to actually do that. Can JMeter replay your access log? So if you actually do a search on Stack Overflow, because I answered somebody specifically with that. Let's actually go to Stack Overflow. There is an Apache plugin, which I'm not so crazy about, which will read from an Apache log file. But if you go here to JMeter and log file, I think it was, you know what? I don't remember exactly, but I have seen some people. I answered somebody actually pretty detailed in terms of how do you actually use a log file to play back something within JMeter. So if you look on Stack Overflow, you can definitely look and see more information about that. The next question. And I just have like 2 more minutes for questions. Sorry, guys, but I do have a hard stop in 2 minutes. So somebody asked, is it possible to do a test case where 100 users simulate a load of 200 to 300 users? So if I understand the question correctly, technically you could have 100 users making 2 requests per second opposed to 200 users making 1 request per second. You're going to get a very similar load. You can't take that to an extreme. In other words, one user making 200 requests per second isn't the same as 200 users making 1 request per second, but you do have some kind of form of trade-off. And then last, somebody asks, does BlazeMeter support WebDriver scripts? Yes, BlazeMeter does support WebDriver scripts. Again, if it works in JMeter, it works in BlazeMeter. Keep in mind, though, you're not going to be able to run more than, I think, like, depending on the size of the service, but you're not going to be able to run more than a couple of threads if you're doing WebDriver scripts. WebDriver was not meant to create load. WebDriver was really meant to check user experience as you're creating load with some other tools. So again, thanks everyone. I will be sending out the recording to everyone who attended. If you have any technical questions, feel free to send an email to support@blazemeter.com. If you have any sales questions about BlazeMeter, then you can send to sales@blazemeter.com. We do have a developer account, which is free. You can go to blazemeter.com and just sign up for our free developer account. You don't need to put a credit card or anything, and start playing with creating load from the cloud, which is pretty cool. And that's it. So again, looking forward to seeing you all, and for the next webinar. I probably will have a follow-up webinar with some other JMeter related topics. So again, thanks.